In the fall of 2019, a USDA extension agronomist named Dale Voss drove a white government pickup down a two-track lane in Cuming County, Nebraska, and stood at the edge of what he called a drainage liability. He had come to look at the bottomland Irwin Shell planned to plant in winter wheat, and he looked at it the way a man looks at a car that has already been totaled. The ground was still carrying the gray sheen of dried Elkhorn River silt, a thin crust of it over the old pasture grass, and Voss walked out onto it, pressed the toe of his boot down, and wrote something on a clipboard he had carried from the truck. He told Irwin that a field that had stood under 3 feet of water for 11 days in April was not a wheat field. He said you might pull 12 bushels an acre off that ground if you were lucky, and with hard red winter wheat trading, around $5, 12 bushels would not cover seed and fuel. He said the smart move was to drain it, disc it under, and wait a season. He was not unkind about it. He was the kind of man who believed very sincerely in the conclusions of his instruments. By June of 2020, that same bottomland carried 61 bushels of turkey red, hard winter wheat per acre. The county average that year on the upland fields, and the tile-drained ground that everyone in Cuming County had been told to plant, was 22 bushels per acre. And that was the number that stood there in the scale house at the co-op elevator when Marcia Holt, a senior buyer from a regional flour mill, read it off the ticket and went quiet. This is the story of the 11 days that changed that ground and the 40 Holstein cows that most of the county thought were a problem, and one man's father's green ledger book, and what happens when the water recedes and someone who knows that particular stretch of soil is still standing on it. If you have ever watched a piece of ground get dismissed by someone who had never wintered on it, stay close. Irwin Shell was 68 years old in the spring of 2019 and had been farming the same 320 acres in Cuming County for 41 years. He was known for 2 things: his patience with old machines and his refusal to sell anything before it had shown him what it was. He ran the same 140-acre bottomland along the east branch of the Elkhorn that his father, August, had worked before him, and he kept 40 Holstein cows on it for reasons the county had largely stopped trying to understand. Holsteins are dairy animals. They are bred for milk production, not beef, and by 2019, Irwin's herd had an average age of 8 years, well past the point where most dairy operations would have culled them into the beef market at a discount. Every livestock sale barn within 60 miles had declined to run them at anything better than canner price, which in practical terms meant you were hauling cattle 100 miles and bringing home less than you spent on diesel. Cope, Irwin's border collie, was 11 years old and had learned not to push the Holsteins any faster than they wanted to go in the mornings. The 2 of them, the dog and the man, moved the cattle from the east fence to the north, draw and back again on a rotation that Irwin had been refining for 15 years without writing most of it down. Irwin watched the grass height and the manure distribution and the condition of the animals' hooves and moved the fence line accordingly, reading the ground the way you read a thing you have been attending to, long enough that the reading is below language. His father had written things down. August Shell had kept a green ledger book from 1951 to 1974, and the book recorded flood years, planting dates, yields, and in the margins the kind of notation you make when you are trying to teach someone something and are not sure yet who the student will be. Irwin had read that book twice a year, for 40 years. The 40 Holsteins were the county's particular confusion. A Holstein is a black and white dairy cow built for converting feed into milk, and Irwin had not been in the dairy business since 2004, when the price of blanked dropped below what it cost him to cool and haul it, and he shut down the milk house and changed the cow's ration from high-energy dairy pellets to the grass and hay, him buying anything. The herd shrank from 62 down to the 40. He could winter comfortably, and those 40 stayed. They gave no milk worth selling. They were 8 years old on average by 2019, which in Holstein years puts an animal firmly in the category that livestock men describe as spent. Every sale barn within 60 miles of Cooming County had taken a look at Irwin's cattle at various points across those years and declined to run them at anything better than canner price, which is the price you receive for old beef cattle sold to processing, calculated by the pound and not by any standard of quality. At canner price, Irwin's 40 Holsteins were worth perhaps $400 a head on a good day, and hauling 40 head of cattle to a sale barn in Stanton or Norfolk on a long diesel run to collect $16,000 in canner returns was not a transaction that made arithmetic sense. So the cattle stayed, and Irwin moved them across the bottomland on his rotation. The spring of 2019 was not the first time the Elkhorn had come out of its banks and crossed the east field. August's ledger listed 7 previous flood years, starting with 1952 and including 1958, 1960-1964, 1969, 1973. What the ledger also recorded, in the patient columns on the right side of each flood year page, was what the ground did the following season. It was not a scientific document. It was a farmer's record, and what it showed was that in 6 of those 7 flood years, the bottomland had yielded better the following spring than it had the year before. The exception was 1969, when a late summer flood had stood so long on the field that it drowned the soil's microbial layer, and the ground needed 2 seasons to recover. August had noted this, too. He had written the water depth and the number of days the water stood, and the date the field dried enough to walk. And then in the yield column for the following year, he had written the number and circled it and drawn a small arrow up or down to indicate the change from the prior year's average. In 6 of 7 cases, the arrow pointed up. August had not had a theory about why, or if he had not written it in the ledger. He had written the numbers down because he noticed them, and he had told Irwin once that the river knew that ground better than the extension office did. Dale Voss was not a bad man. He was 52 years old, held a master's degree in agronomy from the University of Nebraska, and had worked the Cooming County Extension Office for 9 years. He had driven out to look at bottomland after previous Elkhorn flood events, and had helped farmers document their losses and apply for emergency programs and design drainage improvements. And in his experience, bottomland that had been inundated for more than a week required at minimum 1 full growing season before it could be expected to produce a normal crop. The silt disrupted root architecture, he explained to anyone who asked. The anaerobic conditions, while the water stood, could compromise soil biology. The compaction from water weight on the surface altered the pore structure that plant roots depend on for oxygen exchange. He had observed all of these effects. His observations were real. He was not ignoring August's ledger. He did not know it existed. Let me tell you what was actually happening to that soil. When the Elkhorn River ran over its banks in April of 2019, and deposited 3.2 feet of water across Irwin's 140 bottomland acres for 11 days. It did what rivers have been doing to their adjacent ground since before anyone kept records of it. It carried sediment. The Elkhorn draws from a broad drainage basin in northeast Nebraska, crossing ground that is rich in calcium, phosphorus, and the organic residue of a century of prairie and crop rotation. And when it floods, not uniformly, not neatly, but in a fine layer of alluvial clay loam that settles over whatever was there before. The technical term for that deposited material is alluvium, and what makes alluvium valuable is a property that agronomists measure as water-holding capacity. A sandy loam, which is what most of Cuming County's upland fields are built on, holds roughly 1 inch of plant-available water per foot of soil depth. The clay loam alluvium that the elkhorn left behind holds closer to 2.4 inches per foot. That difference does not matter much in a wet year. In a dry year, it is the whole conversation. Irwin had watched his father walk the bottomland after the 1964 flood and come back to the house and open the green ledger and write the date and the water depth and then sit for a moment and write a sentence in the margin that Irwin had memorized. The river paid the ground what the ground was owed. He did not know precisely what August meant by that. By the time the fall of 2019 arrived, he was beginning to. Irwin's 40 Holsteins were part of this, and, in a specific and not sentimental way, let me explain what 15 years of rotational grazing with a large-bodied dairy breed does to a bottomland soil profile, because the Holsteins were not incidental to what happened in June of 2020. A Holstein cow weighing 1,400 pounds, grazing on a half-acre paddock, for 3 days with 39 of her herd mates, deposits roughly 65 pounds of wet manure per animal per day. That is 2,600 pounds of manure across the paddock every 24 hours, concentrated by the fence line into a single dense application, and then the fence moves and the animals move, and the manure is left to break down in place. Irwin had been running this system across his 140 bottomland acres since 2004. The paddock moved on a 10-day rotation, which gave each section of ground 70 days of rest between grazing events, long enough for the manure to begin decomposing, for the soil biology to begin incorporating it, for the earthworm population to start working it downward into the profile. The organic matter content of Irwin's bottomland soil, measured in a core sample taken by Lena in November of 2019 and sent to a laboratory in Lincoln, was 6.8% in the top 6 inches. The county average for upland Cuming County soils was 3.2%. Organic matter does several things for a soil. It feeds the biology, which feeds the nitrogen cycle, which feeds the plant. But in the context of a dry spring, the most important thing organic matter does is hold water. Each percentage point of organic matter in a soil increases that soil's water-holding capacity by approximately 20,000 gallons per acre. Irwin's bottomland, at 6.8%, was holding somewhere in the neighborhood of 72,000 more gallons of water per acre than Ray Kuhn's upland ground at the county average. That is not a rounding error. In the spring of 2020, when the last meaningful rain fell on the 17th of February and did not return until the wheat had already headed and the grain fill was nearly complete, that reservoir was the difference between a crop that was reaching for moisture that existed. The practice which the county had variously described as inefficient, old-fashioned, and in Voss's more careful phrasing, a suboptimal use of the forage resource was doing something to that soil that a soil test would not fully capture until you stood in that field in early May of a dry spring and pushed a probe down to 6 inches and pulled it back out, and held the core in your hand and felt it damp. The Holsteins were, in a language Irwin's father would have used, paying into the ground. They had been paying into it for 15 years. And by the fall of 2019, the flood silt deposit had landed on a soil that was as prepared to receive it as any soil in Cuming County could be. Now consider Ray Kuhn, who farmed 380 acres of upland ground 3 miles to the north of Irwin's place and had, in the spring of 2018, taken out a $47,000 loan to install a new tile drainage system across his lower fields. The tile system was the right answer to the right question. Ray's ground was prone to late spring ponding that delayed planting, and the tile lines were engineered to pull that excess water off the field within 48 hours of a rain event, allowing him to plant on schedule and run the field equipment he had financed alongside the drainage system, and a new variable rate applicator for his anhydrous ammonia. He had done everything his agronomist recommended. He was not a careless man. He was a man operating at the forward edge of conventional best practice in Cuming County, Nebraska, in the year 2018, and he had the credit line and the equipment list to show for it. Ray and Irwin had been neighbors for 20 years, and Ray thought of Irwin the way you think of a relative who is attached to something that has stopped making sense. He did not say this unkindly. He said it the way people who believe in a system say it about people who have not yet adopted the system. Lena Schell came back from the University of Nebraska at Kearney in September of 2019 with a degree in agronomy and a genuine affection for her grandfather and a strong, privately held opinion that the 40 Holsteins needed to go and the bottomland needed to be tile drained and rotated into corn and soybeans on the same schedule as every other viable operation in Cuming County. She did not say this all at once. She said it in installments, the way someone says something they are fairly certain of but are not sure will land well. She had studied the data. The data was clear. She had taken a soil physics course at UNK that spent 2 weeks on drainage and water management, and the central lesson of that section was that poorly drained soils were a production constraint to be engineered around, not a resource to be curated. She had a soil survey of Cuming County on her laptop. She knew where Irwin's bottomland fell on the drainage class map. She had called Dale Voss from campus before she came home, and he had confirmed everything she already believed. She arrived in time to watch Irwin plant 140 acres of turkey red hard winter wheat on the silt-covered bottomland on the 22nd of September 2019 using a John Deere grain drill from 1983 that rattled on the transport frame and left a thin line of oil on the tractor's left rear tire. She stood at the edge of the field and watched the drill rows disappear into the pale gray crust of dried alluvium, and felt the particular frustration of watching someone use equipment that could be replaced by something better to plant a field into conditions she had been told were not suitable. She tried to remember what her soil science professor had said about alluvial clay loam and winter wheat establishment. She could not remember anything specific about flood year silt deposits. She made a note to look it up. Irwin did not explain himself in any length. He said the ground was ready and the drill needed to run before the first hard frost, and that if she wanted to understand the rest of it, she should read the green ledger on the kitchen shelf. He said this without irritation, the way a person says something they have already decided they are only going to say once. She did not read it that week. If you have ever stood at the edge of a field that someone older than you planted on a faith you could not yet verify, and wondered which one of you was wrong, you understand something of what Lena was doing in that field margin in September of 2019. Drop a comment below if you have been in that position on your own ground. She drove over to Ray Kuhn's place the following afternoon and walked his fields, which were well-drained, weed-clean, and planted to a modern, hard-red winter wheat variety with an excellent disease package and a strong yield history in county trials. Ray had just taken delivery of a new variable-rate nitrogen applicator from the equipment dealer in Norfolk. He was ready for spring. He walked the field with Lena and talked about his tile drainage investment and the way the new applicator allowed him to manage his fertilizer inputs at a precision that had not been possible 5 years earlier. He was confident in a way that was easy to stand next to, because it was built on real data and recent results. He was not a man who had been wrong about farming in Cuming County in a normal year. Lena liked him immediately. She drove back to Irwin's place in the early dark and sat at the kitchen table and read the first 3 pages of the Green Ledger, which covered August's planting records for 1951 and 1952, before she put it down. Cope worked the cattle back up to the north fence as the drill finished its last pass on that September evening, and Irwin shut the tractor down and sat for a moment in the cab and looked at the field the way August had looked at it after the 1964 flood, with the particular attention of someone who has been watching a piece of ground long enough to know what it is about to tell you. Dale Voss returned to the subject of Irwin's bottomland in March of 2020 at the Cuming County Spring Extension meeting held in the basement of the Catholic Church in West Point. About 40 producers were there, and the meeting was largely about input costs and spring planting windows and the weather pattern that NOAA had been tracking since February, which was shaping up as one of the drier springs on record for northeast Nebraska. Voss had a slide deck. He went through the planting window data, the input cost projections, the drought probability maps, and at the end of the formal presentation, in the question period, someone asked about Irwin Shell's bottomland wheat because word travels in a county that size. Voss said that the ground was planted, which was accurate, and that the emergence had been adequate, which was also accurate. And then he said that a drainage liability does not become a productive wheat field because the river happened to leave some silt behind, and that he expected the crop would underperform given the spring weather pattern. He said this without heat. The way a man states a thing he has already settled in his mind. He was not being cruel. He was being an agronomist. Irwin was not at the meeting. Lena was. She sat in the 3rd row and listened, and she wrote the words, drainage liability, in her notebook and underlined them, and then she drew a small line next to them and wrote a question mark. She had started reading the Green Ledger in January. The turkey red wheat emerged in October, sending up the thin blue-green first leaf from the alluvial silt. And Lena walked the rows and counted emergence, and found a stand that was thicker than she had expected from a field that had been underwater in April. She did not say this to Irwin. She wrote the plant population count in a notebook she had started keeping specifically for the bottomland, partly because she was trying to understand what her grandfather was doing, and partly because she suspected she might need data eventually to make an argument either for or against what he was doing, and she was not yet sure which direction the argument would run. The winter came dry and cold, as Nebraska winters do, and the wheat tillered under the snow in January and February, adding additional stems from the crown of each plant, building the plant's capacity to fill grain heads the following June. Tillering is the wheat plant's insurance policy, a branching system that means a healthy plant in winter can produce 5 or 6 grain heads from a single seed. The alluvial silt ground, with its organic matter and its moisture reservoir, was carrying its wheat plants through the cold months in better condition than most of the upland fields in the county. Ray Coon's wheat was fine. It was in good condition, well established, carrying a normal tiller count. In February, Ray had applied his pre-plant nitrogen according to the variable rate prescription his agronomist had generated from the fall soil samples, and the fertilizer was sitting in the soil profile waiting for the spring warm-up to make it available to the growing plants. His equipment worked as designed. His crop looked exactly the way a well-managed Cuming County wheat crop was supposed to look in March. And then the rain stopped. There is a specific quality to the light in a Nebraska bottomland in early May, when the winter wheat is approaching head emergence, when the plants are at the stage called jointing, when the stem is beginning to push the developing grain head up from inside the leaf sheath. The color is a green, so dense it reads almost blue in the slanted morning light, and the canopy is closed enough that the ground underneath it has gone cool and damp, while the upland fields to the north are already beginning to show the pale paper color of a dry spring. Lena walked the bottomland on May 4th, 2020, with a soil probe she had borrowed from the extension office, and she took a core from the field at 3 locations and squeezed the soil between her fingers and found moisture at 6 inches in a spring that had not had a meaningful rain event since the 17th of February. He pulled up the soil moisture records from the county monitoring station on her phone and confirmed what the soil was telling her hands. The upland fields were at 16% volumetric water content at the 6-inch mark. The bottomland was at 31%. She drove to Ray's place and walked his field and pushed the probe into his ground at the same 6-inch mark and read 14%. She did not need a textbook to understand what she was looking at. The critical threshold for winter wheat at grain fill is typically 18 to 20% volumetric water content. Below that, the plant begins to shunt its resources toward finishing whatever grain is already developing rather than filling additional kernels. Above it, the plant continues filling. Ray's field was 4 points below the threshold and falling. Irwin's was 11 points above it and holding. She called Dale Voss. She told him what she had found, gave him the probe locations, read him the numbers. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Voss said that the clay loam alluvium would hold more moisture than the sandy upland, which was well established, but that the wheat was still a drainage liability in terms of the yield potential the field could realistically achieve under normal conditions, and that the spring weather pattern was likely to even things out before harvest. She noticed the phrase and wrote it down. She did not argue with him. She went back to the kitchen and opened the green ledger to the page for 1965, the year after the flood August had observed so carefully, and found the yield notation August had written in pencil in the right-hand column, 56 bushels per acre. The county average that year had been 21. She read the number twice and set the book on the table and sat there for a moment. Then she looked out the window toward the east field, where Cope was lying at the edge of the wheat in the evening sun, with his chin on his front paws, watching the crop, the way he watched everything that belonged to Irwin. The drought came official in June, declared by the USDA on the 8th, and by then Ray Kuhn's upland fields were showing the early signs of what dry spring stress does to a wheat crop that has been running on borrowed moisture since March. The flag leaves, the last leaf before the grain head, were beginning to roll, curling inward lengthwise to reduce the surface area exposed to the dry air. Rolled flag leaves at grain fill are not a recoverable condition. They are the plant telling you what the final yield will be. Ray's tile lines had done exactly what they were designed to do. They had pulled the excess water off his fields after every rain event, efficiently and on schedule, and by June of 2020 there was no excess water in Ray's fields. There was no water of any kind in the top foot of soil. The tile drainage had solved the problem Ray had borrowed $47,000 to solve, and in solving, it had left his wheat with no reservoir to draw from in the weeks that mattered most. The county extension office would later report that the 2020 winter wheat harvest in Cuming County averaged 22 bushels per acre, the lowest in 11 years. Several operations that had planted more aggressively in the expectation of a normal spring saw yields in the teens. One farmer southeast of West Point combined 380 acres at 11 bushels per acre and did not speak at the elevator. for most of the morning while his tickets printed. Ray Kuhn came in at 18 bushels per acre on his 380 acres. His tile drainage system had performed exactly as it was designed to perform. His new equipment had run without a breakdown. Everything in Ray's operation had worked correctly, and the result was a wheat harvest that did not cover his input costs for the year, which meant the $47,000 tile loan would carry another season of interest without being reduced by the crop it was supposed to support. He did not blame his agronomist. He did not blame his tile drainage. A drought is not a thing you sue anyone over. He sat with Irwin on the porch in early July and did not talk much, looking out at the fence line between their properties, where Irwin's stubble field was pale and cut, and Ray's upland ground was pale and cut too, and they looked the same from a distance, which was one of the things that made the scale ticket so hard to make sense of. Irwin did not say anything about what was happening across the fence. He poured Ray a cup of coffee from the kitchen and brought it out and set it on the rail. Cope came and lay between them with his head on his paws, and the evening settled into the pasture. The co-op elevator in West Point ran a combine over Irwin's bottomland wheat on the 28th of June 2020, which was a Sunday. The combine came over from the Bauer operation because Pete Bauer's custom crew was the outfit Irwin had been hiring for harvest for 22 years, and Pete had heard enough about the bottomland wheat that he came out himself to run the machine rather than sending one of his operators. He climbed into the cab at 6 in the morning and made 2 header width passes on the east end of the field before he called his wife on the radio and told her the crop looked different than anything he had combined in Cumming County that week, which had been a difficult week of thin, dry crops and disappointing load weights. Lena drove the grain cart, but she positioned the auger under the combine's unloading tube on the 3rd pass and watched the wheat run into the cart and noted that the kernels were plump and hard, not shrunken, which is the physical expression of a grain that filled completely, a grain that had water available to it through the entire fill period. Shrunken kernels are what you see from a crop that ran out of moisture before the starch in each kernel had finished forming. These kernels were not shrunken. She weighed one in her palm when a few spilled onto the auger housing and held it there and looked at it for a moment before the cart filled, and she needed to pull ahead. Pete Bauer ran the first load across the scale at 7:40 in the morning and handed Irwin the scale ticket without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that the number didn't already say. 61 bushels per acre. Irwin folded the ticket and put it in his shirt pocket and walked back out to where the combine was finishing the last pass on the north end of the field, and Lena pulled the grain cart around and watched him walk and tried to remember the last time she had seen him move with any particular urgency and realized. She thought about August's ledger. She thought about the 1965 yield notation. 56 bushels per acre in a year, when the county had averaged 21. She had spent 6 months trying to understand why her grandfather's soil was doing what it was doing, and the answer had been in a pencil notation in the right-hand column of a green ledger on the kitchen shelf from the beginning. She did not cry. She was not the kind of person who cried at soil test results or scale tickets, but she was quiet for the rest of the harvest day in a way that felt different from her ordinary quiet. The full field averaged 61 bushels per acre across 140 acres. It was not a county record. It was just a number on a scale ticket from a bottomland field that a USDA agronomist had called a drainage liability in 3 separate conversations over the course of 8 months. Pete Bauer called Marcia Holt at the flour mill in Hardington that afternoon because he had been looking at test weights and protein readings all morning, and the numbers were running well above what the county's drought year should have been producing, and he thought she would want to know before someone else picked it up. Marcia Holt drove down the next day in a white sedan. and walked the stubble field in low heels that she exchanged for rubber boots she pulled from the trunk before she stepped over the field edge. And she bent down and picked up a handful of the alluvial soil from between the stubble rows and turned it in her palm the way buyers turn things when they are deciding something. She asked Irwin a single question. She wanted to know if the ground had flooded before. Irwin said it flooded when the river said it should. Marcia was quiet for a moment. She looked at the soil in her hand and at the wheat stubble, and at the line on the horizon where Irwin's bottomland met the upland fields to the north, which were pale and dry-looking in the July light. Then she asked to see the scale tickets from the full harvest, and Irwin handed her the folder from his truck cab, and she stood in the stubble and read each one carefully. She made no offer to negotiate. She gave Irwin a price of $6.40 per bushel for the grain he had stored, a premium of 80 cents over the co-op price based on the protein content, the test weights implied and confirmed by the sample she had sent to the lab that morning. 8,540 bushels at $6.40 came to $54,656. She wrote the number on the purchase order without hesitating and handed it to Irwin and said she would want first call on whatever the ground produced next year. She drove back to Hartington and called Dale Voss before the end of the day. The call lasted 11 minutes. Voss asked Lena about it afterward, at the extension office, where she had driven to drop off a copy of the soil data she had compiled. He had the purchase order number already. Someone had told him the price. He was not defensive, not in the way a smaller man might have been. He asked about the alluvium depth, the water-holding capacity readings she had taken in May, the manure load from the Holsteins, the planting date, and the turkey red variety's root architecture compared to modern semi-dwarf varieties. He had a notepad and he wrote things down. He went quiet for a moment at the end, looking at his notes, and then he said that he would like to see the full soil data when she had time to put it together, and that he would like to understand the K-Tau's exchange capacity numbers from the November core samples. Did not use the phrase drainage liability in the conversation. Irwin paid off the remaining balance on the Eastfield equipment note, which was $11,000 in August of 2020. He sold 22 of the 40 Holsteins that fall, not at a canner discount, but at a regular beef auction in Norfolk, where they brought $780 a head because the word had gotten out about the bottomland, and a buyer came looking specifically for animals that had been grazing a silt-enriched cover. 8 years on diverse pasture. The sale brought $17,160. He kept 18 Holsteins. He said 18 was the right number for the ground. Ray Kuhn came over in September and asked if he could walk the bottomland, and Irwin walked it with him and let him take soil from the bank of the east drain with his hands, the way farmers take soil when they are trying to understand something they have been wrong about. Ray did not say much. He picked up the green ledger from the kitchen shelf when Lena offered it and took it home for a weekend and brought it back with a piece of paper inside where he had copied out August's flood year yield columns in a careful hand. 3 other producers in the county asked Irwin about his planting date and his wheat variety that fall. He told them what he knew. He did not charge them for the information, and he did not expand the operation beyond the 140 acres because he understood that the bottomland was its own agreement and could not be replicated on ground that had never had the river on it. Lena wrote up the soil data and sent it to Voss, and Voss incorporated it into a presentation he gave at the 2021 Cuming County Extension meeting, which Irwin did not attend. Lena did. She sat in the second row and listened to Voss describe the water-holding capacity differential between alluvial clay loam and upland sandy loam, and the conditions under which flood-deposited silt could prime bottomland for above-average wheat yields in drought years. He credited the data to the Shell farm. He said it was an observation that warranted further study. He said it carefully and with the register of a man incorporating new information into a model that had room for it, which is the best version of that particular kind of correction. Irwin planted turkey red again that September. Lena set the drill. Cope moved the remaining 18 Holsteins to the east fence in the evening and lay down in the short grass at the edge of the stubble field, while the last of the light moved off the alluvial ground, and the two of them, the old man and the old dog, sat there in the way of people and animals who have been at the same work long enough that the work no longer needs explaining. There are two ways to read a piece of ground. One way counts what the ground produced last year and projects what it ought to produce next year, based on inputs, variety trials, and the assumptions that come with a county average. That way of reading is not wrong exactly, but it is thin. It relies on the ground behaving like the model predicts, which the ground will do when conditions are normal, and stop doing the moment they are not. The other way is August's way, which is to watch the ground across enough flood years and dry years and ordinary years that you stop asking what the ground ought to do and start asking what it has done and what the conditions now resemble and what the river left behind the last time it came over the bank. That way requires time. It requires staying on the ground long enough to accumulate observations that do not reduce to a soil survey. It requires 40 Holstein cows that have been paying into the alluvium since before your agronomist finished his master's degree. A drainage liability is what you see when you look at a flooded bottomland and run the numbers from last year. A seedbed is what Irwin saw when he walked out onto the gray silt crust in August of 2019 and recognized the residue of the river for what it was, which is the same thing August had recognized in 1952 and 1958 and 1964 and written down in a green ledger that no one had asked to see. The river paid the ground what the ground was owed. August had written that in the margin, not knowing who the sentence was for. The wheat knows the soil it is standing in. The soil remembers the river.